This is like dream panel here that I have today here. Folks who have dealt on every continent some of the challenges that we're dealing with here today. And first up here, immediately to my left is Dr. Kuntoro Mangkusubroto, who comes to us from Indonesia. After the tsunami of 2004, the president of Indonesia reached out to Dr. Kuntoro to ask him to come up with a plan and execute it to essentially rebuild probably the singular most devastating storm in terms of its impact on the built environment and on people's lives in all of our memories. Next up I have is Ian Hopkins. Hello. Ian is the Chief Constable of Manchester, Greater Manchester in the United Kingdom. Ian has had actually quite an eventful week here because though we had the most eventful and really challenging time of his professional life, I know, and we'll share some of it here with the May 2017 terrorist attack on the Manchester Arena bombing, a suicide bombing attack. That was not just the arena, but was next to the foyer next to the transportation center. So its disruption was on multiple levels. An investigative report just came out just Tuesday. Tuesday, yeah. And Ian has been fielding some, had to do press release before he came here today to talk about some, but he's sharing with us some of the lessons learned derived from that man-made attack. And then immediate to Ian's left here is our own police commissioner, Billy Evans, from here in the Boston Police Department. Commissioner Evans was a runner in the Boston Marathon. Do you still keep running, don't you, Commissioner?
Yes, I do.
He ran so quickly that the actual event went off after he had completed the race, but I understand continued on to get your uniform back on and come right back.
Right.
Yeah. And Judge Emmett, of course, we don't need to do any further introduction here, but of course with the Harris County here. And last we have Albrecht Broemme, who is the head of the German Federal Agency for Technical Relief, which for Americans, that would be the equivalent of our FEMA. He has a lifelong professional career in firefighting. He was the chief of the Berlin Fire Department and helped merge the East Berlin and West Berlin back earlier in his career into a single department. That's probably sounds to me like one of the singular leadership challenges to accomplish. And particularly had one of the more dramatic experience related to, like Judge Emmett, with the flooding, the Central Europe flooding of 2013. But I know there's a long list of mayhem that you can speak to as a part of this program today. What I'm going to ask each of the panelists to do, and I'm actually going to start, if I could, with Ian, is to share essentially a vignette about the experience that they went through and what were some of the real takeaways, something that they really crystallized as a result of what they had experienced. And then we're actually going to try to tease out of this panel a little bit the work assignment we have as a Global Resilience Research Network. What are some of the needs that need to be done to advance greater risk literacy? How do we push out the education? What are the needs here on design and engineering tools and practice and applications here? And ultimately, how do we scale this and get this going? So it's a rich agenda, and so I want to turn to you first, Ian, if you would, and give us the context that brings you to this conference here today.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Good morning, everybody. Real privilege to be here. For those of you who don't know, the Manchester Arena is an entertainment venue, and on the night of the 22nd of May 2017, there was around 14,500 people in there enjoying an Ariana Grande concert. Following the murderous attack, 22 people sadly lost their lives. 681 people were injured both physically and psychologically, of which 93 were seriously injured with real life-changing injuries. And really importantly, 240 of those victims were under the age of 18, were children. So this is a reflective piece that I wrote probably about 8 weeks after the attack, and it's called From Crisis to Confidence. So Monday the 22nd of May 2017, it started as a normal day and ended as a day never to be forgotten. I woke at 5:45 a.m. and headed into Manchester through the usual rush hour traffic. A full diary and a full week ahead. My thoughts were on an interview that morning for a position on the board of the College of Policing. The day came and went, and I got home around 8 p.m. At 10:50 p.m. my mobile rang. It was my Assistant Chief Constable, Debbie Ford, my duty goal commander. I regularly get calls at all times of the day and night, but this is a call I will never forget. Debbie calmly said, "There's been a bomb at Manchester Arena. We believe at least 10 people are dead." The immediate sense of shock and anger that followed the call, and then the world seemed to speed up as I thought what I needed to do and what I was going to have to do. Never have I felt the weight of leadership as I did at that moment. Once back in headquarters, the scale of what was unfolding was enormous. The information coming in and the demands of the public, media, government for information was growing. But despite the pace and the noise of the control room, I could see around me good people. People who I've known a long time, who I trust, who had practiced for the unthinkable. Not only practiced, but who with colleagues from partner agencies run big operations week in, week out. The brutality of what had taken place quickly became apparent. The number of those murdered grew and grew. The number of seriously injured was testing police officers, ambulance staff, medical staff, and hospitals to the limit. I had to create space for my operational commanders from the demands for information and allow them to do their job. I had to set the tone of the response for our staff and ultimately for the communities of Greater Manchester. It was a crisis. It was unthinkable mass murder. It needed a human response that recognised both the severity of what we were facing and that families had their lives changed forever that night. I needed to be honest about the threat we faced, but demonstrate that I and our emergency responders were in control. How do you humanise something that's unthinkable as a suicide bomber targeting families with young children at a concert? I knew this had to be about those that lost their lives, those that were seriously injured, and those that were traumatised and were scared. It could not and should not be about the terrorist. Resilient cities can't be angry for long. Anger is a very powerful emotion, and it can have destructive results. And uncontrolled anger can lead to arguments, verbal and physical abuse and hatred. In a city as diverse as ours, anger could be divisive. We had to create hope, not fear, and find positivity and determination to come out of the crisis. From my personal perspective, I tried to do this by concentrating on the victims, the community, my Greater Manchester Police colleagues, and the government. The victims, I made the offer after a few days to meet many of the families of the victims who wished to see me. At the time, I wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do. It felt like it was, as I wanted to pass on my condolences in person and to make sure Greater Manchester Police was doing all it could to support them at the time of their greatest need. The decision has led me on an incredible journey of meeting some of the most amazing people who at a time of such loss in their lives mostly just wanted to thank us. It also helped me to talk about the real people and not just the victims, and to make the response to the attack about them. The community. I had a very strong sense of purpose that we could not let the terrorists win by people being scared to go out, spreading hatred and continuing to be angry. I knew I had to work with the other leaders of the councils, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, national policing, and show the world we could carry on. And I remember sitting in a very small room at police headquarters about 16 hours after the attack with the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, the Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, the leader of Manchester City Council and the Mayor of Greater Manchester, and saying that we would do everything that we could to ensure the City Games, an international athletics event, Manchester Marathon and numerous other high-profile events would happen, the first of which was only 3 days away. We did it, and some. Collectively, as a city council, as a police service, as a government, we did it. With hard work redoing risk assessments and event plans in light of the critical threat, and with enormous public support and determination not to give in, we did it. Of course, outside of the large events, there were smaller gatherings and acts of kindness right across our communities. I spoke at many and shared many hugs and tears. One of the things that will never leave me is the public support Greater Manchester Police received over those awful weeks in May and June. From being cheered on the stage in Albert Square to selfies with kids and food and coffee being handed to officers, it all made a huge difference. It bound the police and the community together like never before. My colleagues, they ran towards danger, they worked incredibly long hours, they made critical decisions, they cared, they cried, and some saw things that no human being should ever have to see. Some are so young and have whole careers ahead of them. We have to look after them and provide them with appropriate support so they can continue to serve. We put in place welfare from the start, and whilst we didn't get it right for everyone, we tried. I visited the frontline staff out on patrol, in briefing rooms, in public, in their places of work. Much of this was seen through the media and social media, as is the world today. I also visited them in the places that the media didn't see, at the scene of the attack, in the mortuary, in private, to share in their pain. And finally, the world's media descended on Manchester. They created huge demands on my time and massive pressure organisationally, but they also gave us a platform to show the world our grief, our resilience, our defiance, our hope, and our confidence. And that's for the 22 that never went home. Thank you.
Commissioner Evans and I had the privilege of going over to Manchester and meeting with Ian in January. You know, it's one Manchester is we have here Boston Strong.
Yeah.
And I wonder, Commissioner, I'm sure you are having a bit of a flashback. So we're coming up on the 5th year anniversary, where so much of what Ian has more recently lived was your experience as well. But some reflections on that, and very importantly, moving forward. And so thoughts about recovery and resilience.
Well, Steve, thanks for having me here. You know, I had the longest commute. My office is about a block from here, so when I see everybody from all over the world here, it's like I literally live 3 miles away, and my office is about half a block away. But welcome everyone to the city on behalf of the mayor. But welcome to Steve. I know he's worked hard to put this together. But you know, I've been in the commission for 4.5 years, and you know, looking back on April 15th, 2013. You know, I'm a big marathon. I love to run marathons, and I think it was about my 45th marathon I had run. It was like my 18th Boston, and you know, I set out that morning to run the race, and I was the chief of patrol. I had my commissioner and I had my chief up there, and you know, I put the plan together. You know, we had no intelligence about anyone wanting to set off a bomb, and I ran the race. And I finished about an hour before the bombs went off, and I was in the hot tub, believe it or not, when 2 bombs went off. And you know, I still couldn't believe that happened to our marathon. You know, it's probably the most beautiful day in the city, the most family-friendly day, and the bombs went off. And I remember riding in after I threw on my uniform and just seeing the fear in people's faces. And you know, we went right to work. I met with the commissioner, the mayor, a lot of the community leaders. I know Renee Fielden's here from our emergency management. She was very much involved. And we had to get together and figure out what happened, you know. When I got back to the scene and to see the 3 young bodies lying on the street, it was something I'll never forget. I had just run down that street an hour before that, and to see the joy, the beautiful day, and I always say that's a memory that I'll never get out. And you know, we went right to work, and you know, everyone pulled together, and for the next 5 days, believe it or not, we worked that street. We had to bring in President Obama and his wife, you know, they visited 5 hospitals, which was quite a challenge. And finally, you know, Officer Sean Collier was killed in Watertown by one of the terrorists, and we were out in Watertown, and we searched probably for 19 hours. I went from 1 a.m. in the morning till about 7 p.m. when finally someone came running up to me and 2 of my lieutenants and said, "We think we know where he is. He's in the boat." And literally, I have a black Ford Fusion, which is nice and quiet. We went down on the boat, and we had him in the boat. And you know, for the next hour, we worked with the FBI's hostage recovery team, and we were able to get him out. And you know, I look back at those 5 days, and the whole idea of how the city came together as one. But also, I remember leaving Watertown that night, and I had goosebumps because it was like we just won the war. You know, everybody was out in the streets, clapping, waving American flags, doing whatever. And then, you know, the next morning we had a big event on Fenway Park where Big Poppy was out there. So, you know, but what it did for the city is, as tragic as that was, it pulled the city together. You know, we had the basically Boston Strong model, which I think set the tone for a lot of cities across the country and across the world on how a city comes together. You know, Houston just recently had their terrible flood and whatnot, and their motto was Houston Strong. what happened in the city is everyone pulled together. Everyone rallied around the 270 victims who went to the hospital that day and made sure they were well cared for. The hospitals pulled together. You know, the one fund was established where I think they raised probably $20 million or more. I don't know what the total was, but you know, the city came together like I've never seen it before. So a lot of good things can happen out of a tragedy, and we learned that. And with that also, we learned a lot of things that we did right, things we did wrong. And you know, I know Lenny Marcus is here from Harvard, who really dug into this whole issue of what worked well in Boston. And he talks about this whole idea of swarm intelligence, where there was no leadership throughout those 5 days. Nobody was fighting for who's the leader here. All, whether it was the state police, the FBI, ATF, everyone came together with the whole idea, we got to get these 2 terrorists and we got to make the city safe. And that worked out real well. Throughout that whole week, though, the hotels were putting all our offices up in hotels. People were feeding us. You know, the city really pulled together. And, you know, when we finally reopened the street, which was about 10 days later, you know, it was very emotional for us. But we knew we had to move on and be a resilient city, and we have. You know, we're coming up on the 5-year anniversary, which is April 16th, which is about 2.5 weeks away from now. And we've done a lot of things to target harden what that whole route. You know, we got a lot more cameras out there. We do bag checks. Now, because of Las Vegas, we do a lot of aerial surveillance, which we never had to do. What's happened in Germany and other places, we do a lot of blocking vehicles with snow plows so nobody can drive into our events. And so after this whole event, we've learned a lot of things. You know, all our officers now carry tourniquets on them because our officers, right after that bombing, were all taking their belts off, taking their shirts off. They were making tourniquets. So now all our officers, and we have about 2,200 officers, they all have tourniquets. And it has saved a lot of lives. Believe it or not, we have shootings. This is a pretty safe city, but when we do have shootings, numerous times we've been able to tie off the wounds. We've had a couple officers shot, we've been able to tie them, but we've learned a lot of good things. But I think what happened in Boston was something special. You know, and we'll always remember those victims. And, you know, come April 16th, the governor, the mayor, all of us will be on Boylston Street, where we do ceremonies at the 2 locations where the 2 bombs went off. And, you know, there's a lot of foundations have been formed, the Martin Richard Foundation. You know, we're ready to do a race shot in his memory. A lot of the races in 2.5 weeks continue to run for the victims. So, you know, it really has pulled the city together, made us closer. And I think what happened in Boston was something special. It was a terrible tragedy. I don't ever want to have to experience anything like that. But shortly after that, like 3 months later, is when I became commissioner. And, you know, but knock on wood, things have been pretty good since.
Great. Thank you very much. I want to do a quick shout out for one of the organizations that has spun out. It's an organization called One World Strong. And Dave Fortier, Dave, are you here?
Dave here?
Who is it? And there's going to do a launch event actually this evening on time with the 5th anniversary. But Dave was a survivor. He was of the attack. He was a runner and was injured in the when the bomb went off. But he's forged an organization that basically is creating a peer-to-peer support network for folks around the world, including in Manchester, Paris, Nice, where folks who've been involved with this incident can share and talk with one another. And I think it's going to be a very special and very important organization. So we're thrilled to be connected with them. Albrecht Broemme, President Broemme, can you help us with one of your vignettes here and some of the wisdom that's come out? Probably your challenge is to pick one. But anyways, I would welcome you. And did you have some slides as well that you wanted to use?
Yeah.
Okay, please, go ahead.
I had a dream in 5 chapters. The first dream is, in the year 2043, we all will celebrate the 25th year of the GRRN summit. All of us. And we will say, this was a great idea. It's maybe a pity we started so late, but we started. The second chapter is any great idea coming up in any place of the world will be recognized. The third thing is the best researchers find real solutions for real problems. Number 4, we shorten the time to come along with innovations from maybe 20 years to 10 years. I say so because I mean it's like this. And the most important point maybe is that every politician, every CAO, every citizen accepts that resilient solutions are never the cheapest ones, but any disaster will be much more cost expensive. So now I start with how to manage the start.
Yep.
Show some slides. I've been asked to show some slides
okay.
on the floods we had in Germany.
Do we have the slides here? Oh, it looks like we're working on some technical side. We'll have to describe.
I can start without the slides. You will see them later on.
Okay, very good. Sorry.
It's a flood which has not been as large as in Texas, but it was quite big as well in Germany. It was in the year of 2013, but it was not the only flood. It was one of many floods. We call them, in former times, we called them the flood of the century. So if I take all the events called events of a century, I might be 800 years old, which is not really true. So we had a lot of rainfall in May of 2013, and the groundwater was really high, the moisture was wet, so we had a flood. And many cities had been flooded. The THW had been involved with about 20,000, 30,000 volunteers, which are trained and organized in different types of help we can offer. We had, of course, we don't do it alone, we do it together with the local fire departments. Of course, we also have spontaneous people who say, what can I do? But they are not trained, they are not informed, they have no idea on risk on the event. So it's always a little bit difficult to deal with them. The operation took all over about 4 weeks, 5 weeks, and it was on different places in East Germany and as well as in southern Germany. If you would see the slides, you would know what I mean. And of course, we had to do some rescue actions. We have flooding boats, we have divers, we can build up dams, we can also blast up dams, it depends what has to be done. And so we had been quite well involved to do some assistance to reduce the disaster. But some pictures have been the same that in Texas. People loses everything, and it's always very sad to see that rich people or poor people, they lost everything. And some things can't be bought again. They are just lost, like the pictures from the former times, the photographs, for example. So the THW was very much involved in this terrible flood, and lessons learned, of course, is to make better plans. Be prepared, make better plans. But I always say a real disaster means that all the plans, this does not really work. In this case, there is a need of a team of experienced people who find out now the best decision we can find out with all the experience we have from other events, from other disasters. All the disasters which can follow a plan is not really a disaster, it's just a great thing. Lessons learned from the flood means for the THW. We had also great feedback from the population and from the media. And this means on the other side, it's an effort for the volunteers to keep on working as a volunteer and also to find some new volunteers to follow up the THW. We had some problems with local structures because some of the smaller cities or the smallest counties, they had not really trained staff. So this is a problem if you have not a well-trained staff to manage such a disaster on the local or on the governmental area. And there's a lot of things to be done. One thing is the preparedness of the population. That means how can everybody do something for himself and not saying, oh, the government, they will do what they have to do. Of course, the government will do everything which is possible, but not everything is possible to be done by the government. Everybody has also to do some things by himself. For example, we say everybody has to have some food and some drinking water always at home, and I myself add some bottles of wine are also quite useful for them. We started with catamaran boats for water dike protection, but they are much better with 2 engines in case of one engine fails in a flood. And of course, the communication between the different levels and the different organizations has to be well organized and also well trained. Are disasters foreseeable? I would say no, but we should gather the experience from the last 1,000 years. And in many parts of the world where happens a flood, the same event happened 100 years, 200 years, 400 years away. And everything which happened might happen again. Maybe even worse or cross worse with some other bad things. And there's a lot of needs for research. What does it mean, everybody's resilience? What does it mean, resilience of municipalities? Many people say, oh, it costs money. But we have to explain, yes, it costs some money and also some brain, of course. And it will save a lot of money. In case of emergency, it will save a lot of money, which is impossible without the resilience. And also the resilience of the organizations like fire department, police department, THW or Red Cross. How are we able to operate if there's no GPS or if there's no radio system? How can we work? We should think about how did we work 20 years ago or 100 years ago, even if we were not alive. And the main issue is of this conference, thriving, not just surviving. It's really a great idea, but there is a lot of things to be done. My very last tips is think the unthinkable, be prepared and bring resilience up, be on alert, and enjoy your time between the disasters. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, President Broemme. Last up to get us going here, Dr. Kuntoro Mangkusubroto. Hopefully you will speak to us a bit about the experience of recovering after a tragic event of this scale and share us the experience that came out of the 2004 tsunami.
Thank you, Stephen. A very good morning to everybody. It is indeed a very great honor to me to be here to share my experience leading the rehabilitation and reconstruction after the Indian Ocean tsunami in the year 2005. It hits Aceh, the northernmost province of Indonesia, and left the biggest devastation our country has ever seen. At that time, I received help from the whole world, all of you, for $7.2 billion for the rebuilding effort. So I always feel that I owe the world to show up and share my experiences afterwards. That's the main reason why I'm here. Let me first share what happened. On 26 December 2004, a 24-meter tsunami wave hit Aceh, and in 10 minutes, it destroyed many things, almost everything. The port, the city, the coastal areas, in total of more than 700 kilometers of coastal areas were destroyed, which is equal to the distance between Boston and Washington, D.C. The province itself was located 3 hours flight away from the central government in Jakarta, while the local government completely collapsed. It left 172,000 people, casualties, missing, many more missing, 500,000 displaced persons, and this all happened in an already distressed province, the number 3 most poor in Indonesia, which is basically a militarized zone due to 25 years of civil war with the independent movement. All communication was cut off. What did all do this to the people? It left Aceh in total panic. Nobody really knows what to do during the early days. How do we bounce back from this? How do we exercise our resilience? That's the main question. In my experience, resilience was built by addressing these 4 states of mind after this kind of mega disaster. They are: 1, not knowing what happened, which means we need data information that is correct and fast. That is very rare. 2, not knowing how to deal with what happened, which means the ability to do some kind of emergency planning, but the kind that is not business as usual. 3, not knowing how to implement actions to rebound, which means we need to know how to execute actions in this situation. 4, not knowing how to be self-reliant, which means we have to transfer the confidence and ability of the society to use whatever has been rebuilt to move forward on their own without help anymore from anybody. One complicating factor is usually after a mega disaster. The government is the main actor and authority to deal with these 4 issues, but bureaucracy is bad in operating in emergency. In the Aceh case, knowing the situation, the government established a separate agency, a quasi-government, more flexible government, to rule and govern Aceh during the rebuilding, where all the other institutions and ministries defer their authority to this agency. Don't ask me the politics behind it. It's a nightmare. It worked, since we were able to finish within the 4 years time given. But interestingly, normal bureaucracy mode kicked in again when it was over. And the State Finance Audit Agency took longer than 4 years to finish the audit and was struggling to audit results of the decisions made in emergency time. So aside from the technical, engineering, or technological approaches needed to rebuild resilience, I believe that we should also address the behavioral psychology, governance, organizational approach to deal with the upcoming potential shocks in our society. Thank you.
Well, we saw, and it's been captured here with the vignettes that we have from each of these extraordinary leaders, is the reality, of course, that disasters are global. They're both naturally occurring and they're man-made. The natural disasters that really matter for us are the ones that impact on the man-made environment, on the built environment, and on real people. And one of our challenges that seems to go forward that I would welcome our panel perhaps first responding to is we have turned managing disasters into a profession. That profession has evolved really amazingly over the last 100 years with skills and capabilities, but it's to a specialized group of professionals. And yet, every one of these incidents that you involved the larger community, the larger country, the civil society. with the benefit of being both the professionals who have managed this, but also having lived the experience, what are some of the things that we could be thinking about, should be thinking about for how to better engage and prepare the community for being assistant, being capable of? Now, you had mentioned basically here the challenge often is people want to help, but they may not have the skills. So what are some ideas, and maybe I'll start with you, Al, if you wouldn't mind. Actually, I want to get Ed, if you can jump in here, because
Sure.
about how to engage that, because clearly that's something that you've focused on here as well.
Which one you want to go?
I'll go, you have Ed first, and then I'll have Al second.
Well, in Harris County, we have something called the Community Emergency Response Teams. And these are people who train year-round to help their neighbors. And at this point, we have over 30,000 residents that are trained to react in a time of an emergency. And they're trained in everything from medical emergencies to rescue operations. And while they're not the professional first responders, knowing that you have somebody who is trained to some degree is unbelievably helpful. So we have those 30,000, and then we just have a lot of other people who are in nonprofit organizations, like I mentioned, you know, the Baker Ripley folks. The fact that they could come in and take over that shelter operation without missing a beat. You've got to have that, and you've got to identify them early so that you know who to call on, because as has been mentioned, Boston's strong, Houston's strong. I would make an aside here and say Houston was so strong we won the World Series with the Houston Astros.
We won the World Series too. And how many Patriot victories do we have? We get sick of winning here in Boston.
So knowing that you have this trained group of volunteers out there is absolutely critical. So I would say any community that doesn't have such a community emergency response team really should start that program immediately.
Right. Al, how are you doing this in
The program, as
Germany?
it has been mentioned, neighbors help neighbors is one of the best things we can do. That means they have to be trained, and they have to be willing to accept orders. Of course, they start to work by themselves, but if we say, for example, we have to evacuate a city because there will come a flood or we will have to open a dike, then the people have to leave their houses, and this is always a big problem. Of course, the police has to do it at the very end, but as soon as it is possible, it would be good to understand people that they have to be prepared to leave their house in such a case. If they live in such a place, it should be a plan to leave the things, and then you have to pack the most important papers to be ready to leave the house for such a case. And this has to be transported, this has to be explained to the people, of course by the government, but the government is just a cloud, you know. To do it from neighbors to other neighbors is one of the best things. The THW has about 80,000 volunteers members. The fire service in Germany has about 1.2 million volunteers. They are trained, they have their personal equipment, and they know how to behave in risky areas. And all those people who want to come organized by social media, they are not trained, they have no idea of the risk, and sometimes they cause more problems than they try to solve. But we can't really say, we can't ignore them, but we have to find more and more solutions, maybe also by researchers, what to do with such people. They don't want to come just to look, they want to do something, but they have not really idea what to do.
Because we know people will want to do that. Right? So thinking out how we plan for that reality, and then they're somewhat empowered in the world of social media in a way that they weren't a few years ago. So that's clearly a challenge that we have to navigate. Ian, your thoughts on how to deal with this that's come out of your experience most recently?
So I think capturing existing groups, existing structures, and working with them as part of your normal business is really important. So I think back to, we had some riots in 2011, and the next day there was more young people clearing up the streets of Manchester after the riots than there were actually rioting, and they came together through things like Scouts, Army Cadets, all of those groups under an umbrella of Youth United, and I think those things are really important. I think we have volunteers, we have volunteer police officers. I've got 500 special constables that don't get paid but have exactly the same powers as a police officer. They volunteered 5,000 hours in the week after the Manchester Arena attack to support us, and they have all the same training as a regular officer and all the same powers. So I think there's some of those formal things. One of the challenges I think we have, though, is how do ordinary citizens react? And how do we get them engaged in thinking about, if there's a man-made disaster or a natural disaster, you know, what is my role as a citizen? And it just struck me on the aircraft coming over here, you know, how many people don't watch the safety video? And they don't. They absolutely don't. Now, British Airways had done a really good job. They got all these famous actors trying to make it interesting, but it was still as boring as hell, and nobody was watching it. You know, so how do we get our citizens thinking about the messages that we're trying to give in terms of, you know, for us it's run, hide, tell around a terrorist attack, but, you know, engaging them in being able to give proper first aid and all of those sorts of things. And I think that's a challenge. I think as more and more people, particularly in our cities, live in high-rise buildings, how do you get them to come together as a community so that they understand, you know, if they have to evacuate, where do they go, what do they do? Because there could be more chaos ensues from evacuating a building that's got 5,000-10,000 people living in it onto the streets of a disaster than maybe if they're staying there. So I think that's the bit for me. How do we engage ordinary citizens? How do we get them enthused about it? Not just in the days and weeks after an attack when they all want to help, but that drifts away over time.
Commissioner, I wonder if, because we're talking mainly about civilians and citizens and nonprofits, but there's also the private sector, right? And that's something that, particularly for community policing and others, but, you know, the private sector is dependent also on a resilient community. So some thoughts about how to engage and where are there opportunities?
Well, I think, you know, leading up to the marathon and where it went off, it obviously happened in a busy business private sector area, and we were tied into all their camera systems. We had a great relationship with them, you know, the Back Bay security network, and they're very much involved. And when you talk about what was key, and I always say what is key, and you talk about preparedness, I think that's why what happened in Boston, the response came because we were well prepared. You know, we did a lot of training with the hospitals. You know, we have 8 trauma centers, and we always did, what if this happens, what would be your response? And we do it with all the colleges. We do it with all the other law enforcement. So when that happened, everyone knew each other's role. And, you know, the amazing thing was 270 people were taken from the scene within 20 minutes there, and none of them passed away, and you know, with some serious injury. So I think we always stress how well preparedness is, whether it's working with the private sector, the hospitals, the colleges, the Jewish community centers, because you never know what's happening. And unfortunately here in the States, we have a major issue with guns. You know, we just have so many. And you see what happened, you know, several weeks ago in Parkland, Florida, where we lost so many young students. And that continually happens here. But what we do, and we continue to do, I know Captain Conley's here and Deputy Lydon's here, is we go to all these private institutions and we walk them through, what if you have an active shooter event here? And I know we've worked with this institution, all the colleges. We go to all the public schools, we go to the Catholic schools. We've probably done 500 trainings where our officers will come in and tell them what their responsibilities are and what our role is going to be. And we talk about the whole idea, run, hide, and then fight. You know, we do all that training all the time. So when something was to happen, and unfortunately the surplus of guns in this country, that's something we're constantly working with the community and the private sector about, what do we do to respond? And I know Renee Fielding works at emergency management. She's continually pumping out, you know, what do you do in a disaster? What do you do in an active shooter? And so it's very important to be out there constantly training the public on what their role is should something happen and what to expect from us. And, you know, the hospitals, we constantly train with them. the universities, and all the schools in the area. And, that has really helped us tremendously. So, it's not a surprise when something like this happens. And, whether it's Newtown, we've had so many disasters around guns here that, unlike a lot of your countries, that's more the biggest threat we face as opposed to a terrorism. I always say we lose about 100 kids in our country every day to gun violence. That's, to me, that's terrorism everywhere in our country, and that's something we work hard to do all the time, is prepare people more for the active shooter as opposed to the terrorists.
Yeah. Dr. Kuntoro, one of the other elements of particularly of a scale disaster like yours is that the volunteers, others who come in, are actually from the international community, a variety of relief and rescue organizations. A challenge many times with those cases, these groups themselves can be somewhat disruptive, right, to a local area. And when they leave, you're left with other challenges, often in terms of how to deal with recovery. Could you share some insights about how maybe that could work better when we have international support coming in? How does that, where do we need to evolve that work?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the whole world. Because when tsunami hit Aceh on the second day, on the so-called Boxing Day, everybody helps Aceh. And in a sudden, we were, quote-unquote, piled up with all this donation, all the support, all the sympathy coming from all over the world. And Aceh was a militarized zone. People don't know about that. So they sent everything to Aceh. So the first thing we did actually is to open up Aceh, not a militarized zone anymore. So everybody is open, everybody is welcome to come to Aceh. And you're right, around 900 international NGOs, bilateral, international organization, the Red Cross, immediately were there. To organize, to coordinate this is a huge task. At that time, I found out that actually, in general, the INGO, the international NGO, they don't trust the government. They don't trust the military. But if there's no government and there's no military, who else actually? And that's why it came up with the so-called the quasi-government. What is quasi-government? Jakarta government decided to set up an organization with the power as a government. And they picked me as the director of that. And then I flew to Aceh and declared, I'm now the authority. Look, I'm not a bureaucrat. I'm not coming from the central government. I'm a private person. The government gave full authority to me. Now I'm here. And they really hate also the word authority. I'm here to coordinate you. The hell with that. They don't like it. But I'm here to help you. I'm here to help you to help us. The second question is, how do I help them to help us? Because there's no data, there's no information, and all these INGO, they came 1 month earlier than when I arrived in Aceh. They've known that area much better than me. They've known what villages are really needed for houses, where the hospital is totally destroyed, which of the ports that should be, rebuilt immediately, those kind of things. So actually, if you want to make it simple, leave it to them. Hey guys, you want to help me? Yes. What it is that you want to do? Then the Dutch government say that we want to help you in rebuilding the Malhayati port. Great. The German hospital, the US highway, you name it. So basically 6 becomes very easy. If you plan it based on information coming from those who first came there and actually give us the information. That is day 1, week 1, almost month 1. Later on, we develop all the data, the information, gathered, complete, becoming more complete, and we come into more detail. And then the next thing says that I thank you so much for our support, but my term here is only for 4 years. And that's my decision. Make it 4 years. Why? If it's more than 4 years, or you don't define the term, the people will always rely on you. There will be no independency from the people. They will depend on you. So you have to stick with this. I'll be here. All of our friends coming from all over the world will be here for only 4 years. And after that, you're on your own. So basically, these are the things that I did, such that we can rebuild very fast in only 4 years. And after 4 years, I left Banda Aceh, back to Jakarta, and I told them, from now on, you're on your own. We have built you roads, ports, water supply, everything, hospital. If there's any complaints, you complain to yourself. You don't complain to anybody else. Actually, that's what's happening in Aceh.
Oh. So it's highlighting how very important it is that we're striving to get to more self-sufficiency,
Yes.
greater self-reliance. Though government obviously has a key role, particularly with these large infrastructures like a port. Individuals can't fix a port. They can't go to airport, and how we coordinate that. But there's also, of course, so much knowledge there about, we're so here triggered around sort of the life safety, the immediate day, weeks, that we haven't thought through as well as we need to what that weeks and months and other rest here. So we have case studies like yours that should inform that. But moving into that, Judge, if the weeks after the adrenaline is gone, after the volunteers have come back, how do you sustain the recovery effort in a way that gets you back to not just normal, but hopefully better? What are some of the things that you see as challenges that you're working right now in Houston and the Harris County?
Well, that's a perfect question, because this morning I opened up the Houston Chronicle on my little device, and there's a front page story about how the housing dollars haven't all been spent yet, and it's slow, and it's not happened. And those dollars are from Hurricane Ike in 2008. Really? We haven't recovered from Hurricane Ike yet, and yet since then we've had 2 major floods and Harvey. That's got to change. The other is the public's attention gets distracted. Hurricane Ike hit in 2008. The next week is when the economic meltdown occurred nationally. Media went away, nobody cared. It was like nothing had ever happened, and so we were on our own. So part of it is we just have to come up with a better structure, and I do think that making sure you have organizations that can, I had mentioned the long-term management of case management. Mm-hmm. I have difficulty, with apologies to the FEMA folks who are here, I have difficulty working my way through the whole process of recovery. So you can imagine what that average person is who has never flooded, and suddenly they're on their own. So I think one of the most important things we can do is make sure you have well-trained people on the recovery side. After Ike, I know Harvey's the most recent one, but we learned, those of us who worked to get through the crisis, we're exhausted. And then suddenly you've got people who need help. So you need a whole different group of people who are trained on the recovery phase. And I think that's critical. And that, back to my 2 Ps and 2 Rs and all that, those are separate activities. And so don't rely on the same people for response and recovery.
Chris Evans, you face similar issues here after that adrenaline rush, but you still need, and how do you think through that as a potentially distinct set of challenges?
Well, I think the trauma response is key. I think it was. I think during that whole 5 days, our officers were going nonstop, and a lot of them had seen some terrible things, I'm sure, like Ian's people have, and you don't think to say, that's not natural, you know, and so as the week progressed, we were pulling a lot of the officers offline and making sure they were getting the trauma response and the recovery. And also we were working with the victims, whether they were at the Spalding Hospital, to make sure that whole idea of getting them the counseling, getting them the trauma response. And so we've come a long way, and I think we learned that. So anytime our officers, and we see a lot of terrible things, unfortunately, in our profession, whether it's burn victims or motor vehicle crashes or homicides, is we have a critical incident team that continually works with our officers, and we do it all the time now. And we learn that from that you just can't let people walk away from a disaster and think they're going to be okay. And I always remember, you know, I ran the race, and I was going for 5 days, and I seen a lot of things. And I remember my wife keeps saying to me, you know, it's not natural. You got to go talk to someone. You got to go talk to someone. And after 2 weeks, I was like, all right, I'll go talk to someone. And I did, basically. And it was very good, you know. And I spoke for about an hour. I told all I had done, all I had seen. And afterwards, I said, well, what do you think? What do you think? What's my remedy? What should I do? And he said, just keep running. That's your key for you. Just keep running. And I went home and told my wife, and she's like, that's all he had to say? Just keep running. But my thought is, what we've learned is trauma response in any type of disaster is so key. You know, whether it's the victims, whether it's your officers. And we do it now with a lot of the victims of violence, even on the street. Mayor Walsh now has a trauma response. So when I go to these homicides, I'm on the phone calling people to come out to deal with the mothers who might have witnessed it, the young kids in the neighborhood who might have seen it. So what we've learned is dealing with the community, dealing with the officers, all the bystanders of what happened, getting to those people and getting them the counseling, getting them response. And so that's a big thing we learned. You just can't put your officers back out there and think everything's going to be okay, because it's going to come back to haunt them another day.
Oh. Ian, you're dealing with some of that, I'm sure, now, even with just 10 months after the events in Manchester Arena bombing?
Yes, I mean, support everything that Billy said. Within 3 hours of the attack, I got one of my superintendents, who's a senior police officer, in acting as bronze commander for welfare for my colleagues, because I just knew how big this was going to be. Some of that sadly comes from experience. We had 2 of our officers gunned down and murdered in 2012. And 4 years later, we lost somebody who killed themselves through PTSD, who was one of the first responders. So, you know, that was in my mind to get somebody in and start working on it. And I set them a simple task. Nobody goes home without us knowing where they've been, what they're doing, who they're going home to. I thought it was a simple task. It took until lunchtime for us to know that we'd got sort of 500 people that had been into the scene, around the scene, dealing with victims. I've now got 1,000 officers and staff in a welfare programme. And that ranges from sort of the initial trauma process through to receiving cognitive behavioural therapy treatment. Very few have gone off sick, actually. We've had probably half a dozen that have had a period of sickness in that time, which is quite remarkable. I was worried about, as Billy spoke about, the sort of cumulative effect of being a responder to some of these incidents, but actually what the occupational health people have said is that the arena attack was the thing that tipped them over, not necessarily what they saw or what they did, but the things that they'd previously dealt with in their career that got them to that point that has made them ill. So that's been a big part of it. I've managed to get some money out of the government for the sort of the longer term support of them, which is good. Some of them were so young as well. And you look at us too, and we've been around policing for God knows how many decades. But actually, you know, a number of my officers that were first at the scene, one of them, a young woman, she was 21 years old. It was her 4th shift after coming out of the training school. She'd never seen a dead body. And she walked into what was effectively a war zone. The other group that I think this is emerged, and I've seen this more and more. that you're getting vicarious trauma through people seeing things on social media, seeing things on TV. And because of the amount of young people that were affected in the arena attack, and that the youngest victim was only 8 years old, we saw lots of children in our schools that either knew somebody who'd been there, or knew somebody who knew somebody, or they've seen images on social media. Because you know what, whenever you have a disaster now, people don't just run, they film it and then they run and then they post it on social media. So you're getting this vicarious transfer of trauma as well. So the recovery group, which we did split very much from first response, the City Council led on the recovery. That has focused on how do we support the children in our schools, how do we make sure that we're providing proper mental health facilities for those that need it. And our biggest problem was that most of the people that were there that night weren't from Manchester. Most of the victims weren't from Manchester. They were from other parts of England, so they disappear back to their homes. And that local community and those local people have got no connection with what we were doing and what everybody had gone through. So that's another challenge, that you dissipate the group, and then how do you support them in other areas of the country?
Well, so what we said here very importantly, I think, as a broad of this resilience network agenda is around focus on individual resilience, right? Things that we can learn here, but there's some of those lessons that are transferable to a more aggregate macro level, and also, ultimately to a system level. How do we get conversations going between folks who are dealing with that individual and those who are thinking more about the broader systems is something that we hope will come out of the work that this community might hopefully be able to be successfully doing. I think you're also highlighting, it seems to me, with both the examples here, but all I think carried through, social media is potentially a big enabler for civil engagement, but it also has this potential dark side of potentially amplifying trauma. We talked about it being used in ways for the Cajun Navy and so forth, but we're just groping, right? With this, it's an emergent phenomenon. It's intruding on how we do these management, really understanding both the information it gives us about what's happening, but very importantly, how it can be used in good, constructive ways. These are real challenges that are here. Is there things that in Germany relative to the social media side here that government is wrestling with, giving that this tool essentially democratizes response, for better, for worse, and communities can self-organize? How do you navigate those challenges, and what is some of what you would see as issues that you would hope that this community might potentially help resolve?
If I'm asked what can we do with social media, the first step is to be part of the social media. For every city, for every county has to be part of the social media. They need some young people who are active, because if you are not known in the social media, you won't be accepted in case of an emergency. And of course, if you work on social media, it's no longer the old way how to communicate. Normally, you have a communication officer, and he will prepare some paper, and he will offer it to the boss, and he will offer it to the commissioner, and then after 2 days it will be given for free. And this is no longer the way how to operate in social media. It has to be done right now. And of course, in a good way. So working on social media means also to trust the people who operate the social media, that they will do a good job without always have the communication to the big boss. Of course, they have to know what happens, they have to be informed, and they will send it to the social media. And one big thing is also to say in the social media that happened after an attack in Munich, to say keep at home. It's a better place, keep where you are at the moment, don't go on the streets, and the people listen to it. But this is quite new, it has to be done and done and done.
Good. One thing that I'd like to perhaps talk a little bit to, given that this will be another focus of ours, the whole issue of baking in resilience, designing resilience when we're in recovery. And so, Dr. Kuntoro, I guess this challenge right after these events, and Judge Emmett similarly, right? People just want to put it back together again. I mean, just get it back going. And yet we're plowing potentially billions of dollars of resources into an area where we may just see the exact same event play out in the future. How do you integrate when you're in that recovery and all the crisis here, building back smarter and better? Is that something that you were able to navigate, and is there work that can be done to get that better, Dr. Kuntoro?
Well, in our case, in a culture like Indonesia, and especially in Aceh, after 25 years of political problem, then actually the psychology is people do not trust anybody. That is something that is really a big constraint. So your first challenge is, well, if you don't trust anybody, it's okay, but the future is yours. That is very important. I'm going to stay with you here to help you to rebuild. But after some times, I'm going to leave Aceh. I'm not an Aceh-Nias. I have to go out from Aceh. And from that point, the future is yours. What does it mean? Bottom-up approach. That means if they want to rebuild their villages, it is them who decide what kind of village they want to rebuild. Two extreme. One is just rebuild our village the same as the one that we had before. And that means narrow roads, no drainage, flood every time, those kind of things. But those people who pick that choice, usually those who are not, they don't have the capacity, they don't have the ausdauer, do they have the, to live in tents and temporary shelter more than 6 months. Well, that's very natural. For those who have been living in a temporary shelter for more than a month, then you know that we have to appreciate these feelings. Okay? The other extreme is that if you want to have your villages much better than before, that means wider road, having a safety house, a drainage system, a small school in your village, then it will take a little bit more than 6 months to rebuild. You have to be in the tent, to live in the tent, maybe around 9 months, 10 months. And then if they pick that choice, then they design their own village. Because if they want to widen the road, that means that somebody else's parcel should be, smaller. So that kind of negotiation happened. And by that kind of negotiation happening, at the bottom, you actually build trust among them. Because if tsunami hit an area, then all documents are gone. You don't have any documents. You are lucky if you still have your life. You lost everything. No life certificate, no diplomas, no land certificate, nothing. So that means if you want to rebuild your village, you base on negotiation. This is the border between your land and my parcel. Okay? How do you know that? Well, this is my toilet there in that area. Okay? If you take a straight line from that toilet to the other one, that's my garage. Okay? That kind of things happening. Very simple. But start from that, you build trust. So that's the beginning. So my recipe, if you want to rebuild an area, is you leave it to the people to make their plan, and based on negotiation between them, then you build trust. One thing that is really proud that I can share to you, that is now year 12 after tsunami, and there is no horizontal conflict between villages and families, no conflict at all. Conflict between border, conflict between roads, conflict that the village should be there, or the mosque should be there, the small school should be there. There's no conflict at all. Yet, 25 years they were in conflict. that is something that's really remarkable.
Yeah. Well, Judge, Houstonians are rather proud of doing it their way as individual citizens, and yet you're in a big watershed near a thing called the Gulf of Mexico. And how do you navigate as a lead elected official for Harris County this issue of building back better and stronger?
Well, I can only tell you how I did it, and I think it will be the model in the future. First, you have to be willing to admit that you did things wrong, and that goes against human nature, but it's the truth. I mean, I mentioned building behind the dam. I mean, no rational person would allow that. So within 2 months of Harvey, Harris County, which is, you know, kind of hidebound, conservative approach to the world, we changed all our building codes. We elevated, we said you got to build 2 feet, you can't build here. We say Mother Nature sometimes wins. You have to admit that, not build in areas like that. And the time to do that is immediate, because that's when you have the emotions on the side. And we had absolutely no pushback from the developers or the builders. They just accepted what we did, and we were done. The city of Houston waited a little while, and they haven't gotten it done yet. Because now the city council's arguing about, well, do we really need to do that? So that the time to act to correct past mistakes is immediate. And so I would say do that. But you have to be willing, as an elected official or a public official, to say, yeah, we did that wrong. And people are forgiving. And so I think that's one of the keys that I took away from this whole thing.
Right. I want to open it up here to our audience. We have a few more minutes here with this distinguished panel. So let me go here. If you could say who you are and who you're from, too. How to get people to be more, for those you can't, more proactive than reactive. How do we get that messaging right? We're not so good with that in academia. We love complexity.
But here we've really pushed that see something, say something. You know, when we do big events, like we had a big march against guns the other day, we had 60,000 people march right by here down to the Common. And when you got 60,000 people, you have to educate them on, you know, look for packages, look for stuff out of the ordinary. You know, don't be, like, you set the parameters, no sticks, because we don't want everyone whacking each other over the head with their signs. You know, but my point being, you just have to educate them. And, you know, we try to, in policing, always try to be proactive, whether, you know, we put more lighting in an area so there aren't robberies, whether we take away the shrubbery. It's sort of crime being proactive by neighborhood design. And so whether we're fighting crime or we're fighting terrorism or we're fighting, you know, active shooters, it's all about getting the public involved. So, you know, they tighten up the schools, you know, put metal detectors in schools, you know, putting guns in the school, you know, which is the craziest idea and I've ever heard of. Like, the last thing we need, and I hope there's no big, you know, don't, what's said in this room stays in this room. I'll be booted, but my whole point is, you know, it's just the more you can educate people to look for signs that are out of the ordinary, the better we are. So we're constantly in the business of trying to be proactive, because reactive is too late. And we found that out with the marathon bombing. No one ever anticipated that. But now we do a big educational piece leading up to it on what to look out for. And we do it around Fenway Park where the Red Sox play. They do it around with you know, it's any major event we have is an educational piece to try to have the public be our eyes and ears. And I think, you know, I know Gil's here. He's been involved very much in government. I think the message all across the U.S. is, if you see something, say something. Yeah. As mundane as it can be, as trivia, but let us come, call 911, and let us examine it.
I think, Ian, is it?
I also think it's about building trust with our communities, which helps with our legitimacy, certainly as a police service, it helps with our legitimacy. So being open and honest, explaining when things have gone wrong, explaining why we do things. You know, we have very diverse and very complex communities. That's all of us. That's not just where I work in the UK. Some of them don't trust us. Some of that's historical. Some of that's because of the culture, the background, maybe the countries that they've come from to our country. The police treat them very differently there. So that building of trust with people is really, really important, because certainly in my case, where it is about terrorism, we are communities defeat terrorism, and we need people to come forward and give us information and give us intelligence. I know that there's collectively as a community, that there's things that you can do to help us around technology that flag some of that things up, where things are out of the ordinary, where things are happening that perhaps shouldn't be, that give us a little bit of a head start. But ultimately, it is about people being prepared to come forward and tell us, and that comes from trust in us as public bodies.
I think one of the keys is the work that you're doing, right, is telling the stories of resilience in documentary forms and short forms that are really compelling. One of the things I had an opportunity, I don't know, Eddie Rosenstein, are you here? And Eddie, I had the privilege of working with to put a story together that very few Americans knew 10 years after 9/11, that the largest maritime evacuation in human history happened in Lower Manhattan on 9/11. Nearly 500,000 New Yorkers were evacuated by boat on Lower Manhattan. In Dunkirk, it was 338,000, right? So just as on the scale. And the story did not get told. And in the media capital of the world. And when I asked some of the media folks, how did you miss that story? They sort of just, I said, it's because you weren't looking for it. You were looking for the trauma, and you turned to look for the mayor and for the governor and for the president, but you didn't look for what are everyday people doing right now, coping with that event. And it was there. The probably biggest story that should have been told on 9/11 was just how civil society responded. Julia, I see Wayne here. I think this will be here. Well, I'm going to get you a microphone, okay? So that way everybody can hear on your erudite question.
First, I really want to thank this whole committee, because it's a panel, if you will, because it's incredibly important and very powerful to hear all the narrative stories behind everything. So again, thank you very, very, very much, all of you. You talk about the ordinary citizen. And the ordinary citizen, to me, is an interesting definition, because I think of the unseen people. I think of the differently abled. I think of mental illness and how that plays itself out. I think of the elderly. I think of people who are in hospitals or sick. That other form of the unseen population. What can we do? What will we do? Where will the focus be on the ordinary people who are less ordinary, or they're extraordinary, let's say. So, thank you.
Okay, great. Maybe I know the number basically in the United States for our demographics is 1 out of 5 people really couldn't get out of harm's way when they're a disaster because they're too old, they're too infirm, or they're too young. So how do we deal with this reality that we have lots of folks here who do need help? Ed, could you thoughts on that?
Well, when I came in as county judge in 2007, that was shortly after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita had hit. And I won't take the time to go into all the gory detail, but the evacuation during Hurricane Rita, more people died in the evacuation than would have died if they'd stayed home. And so 2 things came out of that. Number one, we started emphasizing, if you are not in a storm surge area, stay where you are. Or I used a phrase, hunker down, that's kind of taken on its own meaning around the world now. But secondly, we created a registry for people who cannot evacuate on their own. And the problem with that is they have to re-register every year, and it's hard to keep it up to date. But we have to do a better job of that. And now that we have the social media and we have the technology to do it, we just have to identify everybody that will need help evacuating, and we go and get them. It's easy for a hurricane because you know where the storm surge is going to come. An event like Harvey made it much, much more difficult because we didn't know where the rains were going to fall.
And obviously, we're challenged with an earthquake or a tsunami where there's very, very limited notice, right, and thinking through. And that's where maybe helping neighbor is going to be important. I get a blind spot on this side of the room. Is there a question over here? Yes, Fred Rosenberg, please.
you're looking at me, but these two gentlemen to my right are probably going to weigh in on it too. If at all possible, let the first responders handle it. In our case, though, and that can be first responders from the area or those who are in the plan to come in from other parts. Because we have help scheduled from all over the country that comes in. That's great. They couldn't get to us, which is why we had to turn to the private citizens at that point. But the ideal is always to allow the professionals to handle it. But if you do go to the private citizens and let them come in, we've learned to set it up in a more organized way going forward. Because I'll give you one quick example. They were pulling thousands of people out of harm's way, out of flooded homes. They were taking them to dry land, dropping them. Nobody kept track of where they were being put. So when we tried to get them to the shelters the next day, nobody knew where all these people were. So in the future, we're going to have little RFID chips, and you're going to put a chip with every group so that you know where that group was dropped. But I can't emphasize enough, and I think these two gentlemen will back me up, if at all possible, let the professionals handle it.
I would absolutely concur with that. I had 4,000 police officers from around the United Kingdom descend on Greater Manchester. That in itself is a huge logistical exercise in making sure we know where they are, where they're staying. The people that work for me made 25,000 packed lunches over a 2-week period just to feed them. We were turning over 200 rooms a day just to be able to put people up. So it's really important, and it's important that we get control around particularly a high threat situation, which is what we had. So yes, there were members of the public in there. There were the staff that work at the arena. There was the staff that work in the railway. But the volunteer wave was after we got that control. And then that's really important. And actually for me, that was, the city council coordinating that. And there were some amazing stories of what volunteers actually did. But I think it has to be controlled.
Give me the final question here, and then we're going to have a panel wrap up here. Because you guys will break before we get to our lunch. Okay, go ahead.
Thanks for all of the distinguished speakers. My name is Xiang Wang, a professor from Fudan University of China. I have some questions to Mr. Williams-Evans. As we know, city of Boston should be one of the safest in the United States. But under the higher pressure and the impact of climate change, these cities, such as other cities located coastline, have to be experienced or attacked by heavy climate change, such as heavy snowstorming and flooding. I just wonder, do you have any pre-alarming system and recover strategies after the extreme climate events? Do you have any new master planning for this city, such as the city of New York has put forward the master planning for the year 2050? Thanks.
We're continually working on it. I know Renee, who works with the Office of Emergency Management.
Renee, where are you at here? Okay, can we get a microphone to Renee here? Maybe she can also.
Renee, she's constantly working on evacuation routes in the city, and more, and Renee can talk too, we've learned the last couple storms, we've had some northeastern real snowstorms and rainstorms that we've seen water come up to the levels we've never seen it in our seaport. And so we're constantly thinking about that, how climate change. In our whole seaport area, when I grew up as a young kid, none of that was there. And that area has been built up so much, and now we have flooding coming on. So, we're working on plans and alarm systems and evacuation routes. Renee, you want to butt in here?
Please. So Renee is the head of emergency management for the city of Boston.
Yeah.
Welcome to Boston, everyone. Yes, there's a couple of things. We have Climate Ready Boston, and they produced a report not too long ago that's out, and it's on the city's website and shared. And the mayor also did Imagine Boston 2030. So we're looking at the issues that surround the city and what are they going to be 20 years from now, and how do we go about planning for that population and the city and what we want to do. And so that report has also been released. So a couple of good reports that have all of the city agencies together talking about the issues that we face and how we're going to plan for them. And like the commissioner said, we're constantly working on the city's evacuation route and looking at the threats we face and sheltering. Sheltering's huge. When these disasters come, where are we going to put all of these people that just get displaced and don't have another place to go?
Okay. So really interesting, this neighborhood is called Back Bay. Now, the reason why it's called Back Bay was because this was all wetlands that had water in it here, and we just sort of built over it to build the city, right? So many challenges around the world with the reality that we built things where it made sense from an economy, where people want to live, but may now not look like it makes sense from what risks that may be posing, and how we adapt to that is very logical. Judge Emmett, I want to give you the last word here, and then we're going to wrap up. So you can see people coming in.
Right.
These are the folks going to help feed, so everybody can get up and stretch and move out. That's how our next evolution is. But Judge.
What I hope to see come of this involves all of you. I'll take you back to my days in the Texas legislature back in the late 70s, early 80s. Seatbelts were not mandated to be used. In the Texas legislature, no, this is private rights. You're not going to tell us what to do. And there was one gentleman named Red Duke, who was a trauma surgeon at Memorial Hermann Hospital. And he had such respect and authority that when he came to the legislature and talked to us, he's the one who actually talked the Texas legislators into doing what was right. And of course, since then, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of lives have been saved in Texas because of seatbelts. The same needs to apply to resilience going forward. So wherever you are, do not be afraid to go to public officials and start establishing yourself as somebody that they have to turn to, they have to listen to, because we're not experts on anything. Very few elected officials are experts on anything. And so we have to restore that trust, and I think resilience is one of those topics that academics can play a huge role, and so that's why this conference is so important to me. So thank you, Steve.
Well, thank you very much, and thank everybody on this panel and all of you.